Welcome to Purple Elephant Radio, where we discuss the mindsets, philosophies, and strategies needed to make art and tell stories that make a dent in this era of abundance. This is a show for the unbound creative, the undefinable artists, and the unidentified philosophers. I'm your host, Sean Green. Welcome back to Purple Elephant Radio. Today's episode, I think, is going to be very information-packed. I almost said action-packed, but I'm going to try to present it as excitingly as possible. But this episode is going to be about critical thinking. And that's a very, very general topic. And so what I'm going to do is basically explain critical thinking processes, rules of thumb, ways to go about weighing decisions and looking at statistics, but do it in the domains of education, politics, and science. So I'll get into the specifics of what I mean by rules of thumb for thinking in just a bit. But really, to start this episode off, I wanted to present a little bit of a story. And this story is a true one that happened a long, long time ago, and it's a story of Socrates' death. Now, I'm sure many people know who Socrates is, the Greek philosopher. And I'll admit, my insight into his actual philosophy is pretty limited. But I did recently learn about the story of his death, which I think is quite interesting and quite relevant to modern times. So I'll give sort of the summarized version as quickly as I can. So basically, the story goes, he was charged by the state on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. And impiety basically means like disrespecting the authority. In this case, it related to disrespecting the state-approved gods in Athens. So he was charged on those two things, and there was a trial where he had a chance to defend himself. And it's quite interesting because there were many times, at least according to Plato's account, there were many times where he had the chance to sort of apologize, concede, give up the point, and sort of allow himself to be set free. And that was kind of the common theme. But throughout the trial, in his defense, he was very arrogant, almost intentionally, ironically arrogant. I think I remember something, I may be misquoting this, but something along the lines of, they asked him what he thinks would be a fair punishment for the charges he's been charged with. And he said something along the lines of, well, I think for corrupting the youth, I should get reimbursed for all the time I spent educating them and given free food and housing for the rest of my life. So very, very arrogant response. And obviously, the jury did not go for that. They sentenced him to the death penalty, which in that time meant drinking poison. And so in that time, so he was sentenced to death, was in a prison for, I think, a couple weeks or a little bit of time before he was actually sentenced to death. And within that time in prison, he had multiple chances to escape. His followers or his students of his philosophy were constantly giving him opportunities to escape the prison and run away, go somewhere else. But he refused. And now at this point, you may be thinking, okay, this guy is suicidal, or he is just completely ignorant and oblivious to what's going on. And I mean, considering this was a very, very wise person, I don't think we can say either are true. And so, long story short, he drinks the poison, he dies. And in doing so, really, I think he sort of cemented himself in history. Because Socrates himself never published any writings. And all the accounts that we have of him today are from other people writing about him. And so I think, I don't think this was his direct intention, but I think one thing that came from that was that he was sort of memorialized as this grand figure in ancient Greece. And I'm not really talking about the story because, I think he's such a great person. I think he had a lot of great contributions. I think he had some contributions that weren't as great. He was very anti-democratic, for example. But the reason I start this episode off with that story is because when you look at, I mentioned he was charged with corrupting the youth. When you look at what that actually meant, it wasn't like he was instilling a certain ideology or like having the youth think in a very specific way. In fact, he did just the opposite. His sort of method for teaching was that he would basically have some expert come into his class. I think it was called something else at that time, but he would have an expert come in. That expert would share as much as they knew about a topic, and a lot of times this was like moral-based, virtue-based. So someone who's very confident on, in the military, they know what courage is. And so that expert would come in, define the word, and Socrates would hit them with question after question after question, and basically getting this expert on their toes to the point of them either revealing an inconsistency or sort of admitting something that they don't know. And it basically made the experts in Athens, the wise, the elite, look foolish. And he taught that method of questioning to the youth. And I mean, in some very, very radical examples, it sort of gave the youth, at least some youth, justification for, I think one thing was beating up their own father. And so it definitely got to this crazy point where, yes, there was definitely some inherent danger in what he was sharing, but looking at it from an objective lens, teaching youth to question authority on its own, I mean, at least today, would not be worthy of the death penalty, especially when he's not teaching an ideology, but rather teaching a rejection of all ideologies, which is another way of saying rejecting all implied taught morals. So I open up this episode with that story to say, yes, he had a moral backbone. I think the fact that he had multiple chances to concede, to apologize, to run away, to escape, and he chose not to, shows a lot of character. But I also want to make the point, and the reason I think it relates to modern times, is that I think today he would have had a similar fate. Although he would not have been sentenced to the death penalty, I think he would have had the modern day equivalent of being digitally canceled. I also think that if he were around today, he would not be considered as wise as we sort of vaguely know him as in the culture. And again, I think it relates to sort of this gap of time where we can look at not necessarily all his flaws, but we can see the arc of his story. And it can be something that we respect. But if that were happening today, and I think there are some examples, I'm not going to name names, but there are some influential thought leaders who are having a similar fate, where they are questioning certain things and sort of getting this digital charge of corrupting the youth or charges of disrespecting authority. But with Socrates specifically, and this is the thing that I really respect about his philosophy, is that he was really focused on falsification, trying to prove something that is assumed to be right, trying to prove that it is false. And I think if you ask a hard scientist, not a social scientist, but someone who is studying physics or rocket science, something like that, they're constantly trying to falsify a given theory to find something that is more correct. And so I think falsification is a good opener into one of the major concepts in this episode. And if you notice, if you're watching the episode, I have this book, Anti-Fragile, sitting up by Nassim Taleb. And so some of the ideas that I'm going to be presenting are inspired by this book, but then there's also a couple ideas that aren't necessarily coming from that book. But falsifiability is something that I've heard about for quite a bit of time. I think I might have heard it first from Naval Ravikant. But basically, it means a science must be a science if a claim can be falsified. So saying that another way, something that can't be proven false is not a true scientific claim. And I should mention, I'm not going to be naming too many specific examples because I think a lot of the things that are rolling around in my head are going to be pretty polarizing to the audience. So I'll ask you to fill in the blank for these frameworks that I'm presenting to you. So falsifiability. Something needs to be able to be proven false. And something that came from this Anti-Fragile book, which I thought was really interesting, is that it's much easier to prove something is false than it is to prove something is absolutely true. So let's give a generic example. In the book, this was presented. So let's say someone has the claim all swans are white. All the swans are white. All it takes is one black swan to prove the hypothesis completely incorrect. Whereas for that claim to be entirely true, it really can't be said with absolute certainty. It can be the main theory. Yes, we assume all swans are white until we see one that is a different color, but we can never say that that is absolutely certain, because there is always a chance of finding a different colored swan. So that's a really, really important idea, and I think something that's been lost, especially in social sciences as of recently, where a given claim, especially a moral-based claim, is sort of presented without any chance of falsifying it. And so with this idea of falsifiability, and basically saying it's much easier to prove something is false than it is true, it's important to see that subtractive knowledge, subtractive advice, is more important than additive advice. Now, what do I mean by that? And this I feel comfortable giving some specific examples. So especially in the nutritional space, we hear stuff like, going vegan is good for your health, going keto is good for your health, going paleo, diet after diet after diet. But really all it takes is the subtractive knowledge. Sugar, don't eat sugar. Soda, don't drink soda. Meat, don't have more than this portion of meat. So really, instead of trying to find, in the case of nutrition, rather than finding the end-all be-all of solutions that works across the board, or at least works for your subset of people, instead of seeking that, all we need to do is find out what we can't eat, or in the case of nutrition, what we can't be doing. In doing that, there's also less chance of there being sort of this moralistic dilemma. Like in the case of nutrition, when people are arguing what's better for your health, well, usually people can agree on the fact that sugar is not good for health, especially excess sugar. You can find the thing that everyone agrees is not good, and that becomes the rule of thumb for the culture. And so in the book Anti-Fragile, Nassim Taleb refers to this as via negativa lifestyle. So a way of living where you're focused on avoiding the negative rather than trying to scope out what is the positive, correct information. So that piece alone, can help you simply go through life without feeling so flustered trying to find the perfect theory or the perfect diet or piece of advice to kind of satisfy your life purpose. Focused on avoiding the things that are bad for you, it's much easier to prove is not good for health than it is to find the thing that is great for your health. So subtract before you start adding things. And in the same vein of that, and I'm going to stick on nutritional science for just a bit because I think it's a pretty overarching theme that most people can relate to. I also want to talk about confirmation fallacy, which is basically when you are using specific research studies to support your moralistic claim. And keep in mind, this can be taken well outside the realm of nutritional science. But what that basically means is, let's say someone who is a devout vegan may be looking for nutritional science research that's based on the claim that eating meat is bad for you. And honestly, that can be done for really anything across the moral board. One thing I've seen a lot on both sides of the political spectrum is using sort of these despair metrics. So suicide, anxiety, depression, these metrics are sort of being cherry-picked to support a correlation. So I think this is actually correct to say social media use is correlated with depression and anxiety. But someone may also see a uptick in the anxiety and depression rates of the youth and say, they've been eating more of this food, or they've been playing more violent video games, or they've been whatever, insert the blank there, but they're taking this one stat of data and using it to support any number of claims where that data is correlated with the uptick. And without getting too in the weeds of statistics, this can also be done in the reverse. So we may say anxiety and depression has been increasing for the younger population at the same time as they are less likely to date, less likely to do activities in person, opting for something digital. So again, these are not actual research science claims. I'm just saying that one metric of anxiety and depression increases can be used to support any number of correlations. And transitioning to that, I think that's seen quite a bit in legacy media and social media. And so really, the media's portrayal of science is something that it definitely frustrates me quite a bit, I'll be honest. I think when we talk about a certain scientific claim or scientific breakthrough, it's often cherry-picked in the media for the purpose of gaining attention. And I'm not saying this is some corrupt thing. I'm saying it's the nature of how these people make money. I mean, the fact is, the more attention you get, the more ad revenue you can make. And so it only makes sense to focus on the most sensational news. And I think one of the errors in that sensational type of portrayal of scientific research is this confusion of absence of evidence and evidence of absence. So what do I mean by that? Basically, let's say there's a scientific paper and they conclude that, I'm sort of thinking here, like fish oil does not help with Alzheimer's. I'm not saying that's true or false. I'm just saying that's an example that comes to my mind. In concluding that, it's not saying that fish oil does not help with Alzheimer's. It's saying that with these specific criteria, with the amount that they were given, there was no evidence that it helped protect against Alzheimer's. So the media may portray that and say, okay, fish oil doesn't work. Stop buying fish oil. It's a scam. It doesn't work at all. But really, maybe the dose isn't right of the fish oil. Maybe it's coming from the wrong fish. Maybe, again, just kind of thinking out loud, maybe there is some type of fish with a higher mercury content. And if they were to use another type of fish, that the omega-3s would be more effective. These are just some spitballed ideas, but I need to emphasize this as much as I can. These are not based on scientific studies. I'm sort of giving you this framework so that you can start to look at the research that's being presented to you in the media and use these frameworks to ask yourself, is this actually evidence that it doesn't work? Or is there a chance that it is just showing that those criteria did not work? And there are still other ways to do a study where that same ingredient may help with that same condition. And sticking on the media's representation of statistics just a little bit longer, I think this is the major thing that I see going wrong with the sensationalization. It's the confusion of causation and correlation. This frustrates me so much, especially when I see it used in just everyday speech. When someone very casually says, oh, this caused that, even something in their own life. There's a confusion of correlation and causation. Correlation basically means these two things arose at the same time. To say what I said before, anxiety is rising with the rate of social media usage. It's correlated. That does not mean social media caused anxiety and depression. And it's also not saying more anxiety and depression cause people to use social media more. They just exist together. And so this is another idea from the Anti-Fragile book, this idea of epiphenomenon, which is basically what I just described. So A and B arise at the same time, or A arises while B decreases at the same proportion. So that is epiphenomenon, two things happening simultaneously. So forgive me for being a little all over the place, but transitioning from science to history, I think we see this error quite a bit. We say, World War I caused the rise of Nazism in Germany, or the New Deal allowed people to rise above the Great Depression, or World War II caused people to rise above the Great Depression. So we see that a lot. We say one caused the other. It's difficult to find out if A causes B in the case of history, but it's very easy to debunk a cause. Did B come before A in linear time? So let's say the claim is people moved to the suburbs because businesses moved out of the city around the 60s and the 70s. If it's shown that there was a big migration to the suburbs before businesses left, then we can say that didn't cause, A did not cause B. So again, that idea of falsifiability, much easier to prove a false claim. And why am I focused so much on proving something false? I mean, doesn't it seem a little pessimistic that I'm trying to debunk certain ideas? Which again, I have not named any specifics yet. The reason I'm trying to do this is because I think in modern times, we are sort of consensus driven rather than driven on our own critical, logical, rational insight. So basically the idea that the majority of the population thinks is right is assumed to be right because most people think that. And it completely negates the possibility that the majority could be wrong, or that the majority could not be absolutely right. So yes, they may have seen a correlation and correctly attributed that, but they're missing that causation was not actually there. So that's all to say that cause and effect is extremely hard to show. And so whenever you hear in the media, blank caused blank, I just want you to, use that heuristic. Was it caused or was it correlated? Because correlation, that's possible to show, but it also leaves a level of skepticism. So yes, those things rose at the same time, but we can at least keep a healthy distance and say, this is not the definitive reason why. And I bring this up because I think it's really important and relevant when we talk about the social issues of our time. Stuff like climate change and racial injustice. We need to be a little bit more aware and a little bit more skeptical of jumping straight to cause and effect. Because if we misattribute the cause of something and we put all our eggs in that basket, that caused that, so we need to get rid of that thing. We put all our eggs in that basket, then we may be missing the actual cause or the many number of causes instead of focusing on just that one thing. So I hope that makes sense. Basically, I'm going to say this one more time and I may cut this out. Basically, when we say blank caused blank, we ignore the fact that there are plenty of other causes that could also be attributed to that causation. Because more than likely, it's never going to be one thing caused the next. When we talk about world wars and what was the one thing that caused the world war, we can say that. But of course, there are countless other variables that would cause a war. And so the whole bundle of those potential causes would be said it correlated with the war. And in doing that, we remain open-minded and we don't get so locked on one problem. And we allow ourselves to accept and respond to potentially multiple correlations. I think another important thing to look at when talking about statistics is this idea of statistics over time. So this sort of ties in history and science. So, one thing that I'm thinking off the top of my head, you can see a correlation between an increase in heart disease and an increase in vegetable oils, polyunsaturated fats. Basically the switch from like beef tallow and butter to these hydrogenated omega-6 oils. And I will definitely link something because that is a very specific example. So we can see the correlation. I think it was probably 1930s, 40s, or 50s where that uptick began. Now, even saying that, where do we draw the line? And what I mean by draw the line, where do we draw the trend line? So if we have a scatter plot, where we say, okay, 1 million people had heart disease at this year, 2 million people had heart disease at that year, 3 million had heart disease at that year. And so basically we need to decide where are we drawing that linear line. And that's really, really important, especially when we're making future predictions. So I hope this makes sense. If, let's say we had data from 1900 to the year 2023, and let's keep on this example of nutrition and heart disease. If we began to make that line at, say, the year 2000, and 20 years later, so 2020, that line may look like pretty flat because people have had heart disease for, the numbers didn't increase that massively. But if we began to draw that line at, say, 1930 or 1940, we may see a much sharper uptick because we're measuring a bigger time set. And I apologize if any statistics majors are watching this. I know I'm not using the right vocabulary. I'm just trying to present this as best I can. So it matters. Looking at the time scale, the time axis, when talking about trends in data. And that relates to one other big trend I've noticed in recent years that has really upset me. And it's this overuse and weaponization of the term misinformation. To be clear, misinformation exists. To say the earth is flat is completely false. That is misinformation. But we can't say that questioning something is misinformation, because it is not. And again, that goes back to the Death of Socrates. Teaching the youth how to question something that's given in the status quo, whether it relates to morals or a certain subset or a conclusion drawn from data. That is allowed to be questioned. And to not agree with that premise, which you are more than welcome to do, I will argue against you tooth and nail. But the fact is that questioning is healthy. And, I saw this somewhere recently. It does seem absurd to someone who is really set on the claim that, say, vaccines cause autism, that cause word. Arguing against someone like that who is so set in their ways, it can seem a little absurd for someone who understands the safety of vaccines. But to deny that person or to just dismiss them as completely ignorant and idiotic makes them stick to their belief even harder. So unless science is focused on finding the collective truth, rather than shoving information and conclusions down someone's throat, then there's going to be an increase in division. So I think that's a really important point. I want to make this crystal clear, because this really draws in politics. Because for whatever reason, science has somehow become political, which I never thought I would have seen the day. But for that vaccine example, for someone who completely denies the validity of vaccines and they think something very crazy, come to some crazy conclusion about them, talk to them, debate them. Do not call them stupid and ignorant without saying your rationale. And better yet would be to not use the name calling and just stick to facts. So it does take a level-headedness to have those debates with people. Even if it feels like, you're sinking to their level, you're giving them a platform, you're allowing them to seem valid, you're completely denying the fact that if you use a very rational argument, maybe you won't convince that person, but the viewer of, say, a debate where that's going on, an interview where that's going on, you are basically assuming the viewer is as ignorant as that person. I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but I'm basically saying there's no need to name call the misinformed, to completely disregard and disrespect the misinformed. There has to be a compassion for them. And I don't mean a pitiful compassion, where you feel morally superior to them because you're saying, oh, they really don't get it. Yeah, they just must be stupid. I'll try to talk to them. I'll try to see what I can do. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, really sit with them as level-headed as you can be and say, why do you think this? Where are you getting that data? And likely they won't have any data if it's a completely misinformed idea. Look at their data, present the data that you're assuming to be true, and compare it. I know, I almost feel like this is an unpopular opinion to say don't completely disregard the people being called misinformers, but sit with them and prove them wrong. So yes, I definitely see the other side of the coin. There are some people who are going to stick with the misinformed because they like that person. There is the populist political side of scientific debates. I totally get that. But I really think that's being overestimated. I think the vast majority of people who are sort of seeking out the nuance of a certain topic and not assuming causation on one side of the aisle or the other. They're not assuming this is absolutely good or this is absolutely bad. They're somewhere in the middle and they're trying to piece together the truth. So I know, just to conclude with this little tangent, I'm basically saying, hear people out. Let go of the name calling, even if they do seem to be saying the stupidest things on earth. Talk to them. And rather than specifically focusing on your point of view, your claim, and arguing directly against their claim, focus on the method you got to the conclusion. So what I mean by that is, that person who is completely misinformed about vaccines. Ask them, what was the process that led you to that conclusion? What was the pattern of thinking? Do you also believe that, the earth is flat, for example? Is there a correlation with certain conspiratorial beliefs? And, explain your own process. Here's why I think this thing. Here's why I trust this authority figure who said this thing. Here's what the data says, if it's statistical, and why I think they came to the correct conclusion. It can't be that much harder than that. It definitely takes some work. But name calling only divides. That's the truth. No one has ever been convinced of your claim because they were continually called an idiot and wrong. No, they're going to stick tighter to their belief. They're going to find their collective that agrees with them. So basically what I'm saying is a lack of open-mindedness in science is a reason why there's so much divisiveness. It's correlated, not caused. So I'll get off that side of things. And really the last thing I wanted to talk about, I may be poking a little bit at professors here, but it's this idea of lecturing the bird to fly. So I'm sure someone can understand it pretty well. For basically a Harvard professor to bring all these birds in, give a big, intense mathematical lecture about why flying happens, explain all the math that's involved in it, and then at the end of the class, give yourself a pat on the back because the birds have left and they could finally fly. It's basically assuming that the intellect, the rational, is the cause of intuitive knowledge, intuitive experience. And so to bring in another idea, I will tie this all together. There's this idea that I got from Thomas Sowell of mundane knowledge versus intellectual knowledge, intellectual and academic knowledge. Mundane knowledge relates to the car mechanic who knows how to fix your engine. It relates to the plumber who knows how to fix your toilet. It relates to, me as a server who knows how to handle a customer complaint. It's these little things that a professor wouldn't necessarily know how to do. And it's what makes up the majority of a functioning society. Just as a made-up statistics, let's say 90% of knowledge is mundane knowledge that allows a society to function. And 10% is intellectual or academic knowledge. And it's usually confined to the institutions of that knowledge. So obviously universities, but also, think tanks on both sides of the aisle. So it's a very small subset. And yet the ideas in the intellectual sphere seem to sort of precipitate across the whole of society. And that becomes the general consensus. The experts said it, so it must trickle down to everyone else. And listen, I'm not saying that the professor has the same or a lower IQ than the plumber. It's possible, but more likely the academic is going to be objectively smarter. Like if you took one professor and one plumber, I would put my money to say that the professor would have higher IQ. But when we look at the collective, the whole of a society, the 90% of the population, the 90% of actions that are requiring mundane knowledge, vastly overwhelm that small subset of intellectual knowledge. And so how does this relate to real life? How does this relate to policy, politics? Just for one example, and this is something I got from, not this book, but another one by Thomas Sowell. Basically, if you look at rent control, especially in New York, from a moralistic lens, it makes sense for someone in the government to say, these people are getting screwed over because the landlords keep upping the rent. So it makes sense, let the people who can hardly afford this place, let's not have them keep increasing the rent. So they set down a law. It says all these apartments will be rent controlled. Then what happens is there's a trade-off. Because rent stays the same, the landlord is not able to keep pace with, say, inflation or different technological improvements. So they can't put as much renovation into those apartments. And because they can't put as much renovation into those apartments, they become more run down. They lose the basic improvements that apartments without rent control, luxury apartments, are constantly gaining. And I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I do think that in the case of rent control, there is like luxury apartments that stands outside of that. So the developers focus on those because they know they can keep increasing their money. And the rent-controlled apartments continue to deteriorate. So that is sort of the rational argument why it doesn't work. And of course, from a moral lens, some people are going to get screwed over. There are going to be a couple landlords who perhaps raise the price unfairly, but it ignores the majority of landlords who are raising the price because it is what the general housing market requires. So that's probably the most specific example that I will give in this episode. But I just want you to think that through. That when it comes to policies, mainly political policies, but also in certain organizations, there is the moral lens. We are doing this because it helps people. And then I don't want to denigrate the moral lens, but there's the moral lens and the more rational trade-off based lens. So the moral lens is always going to seem like the right idea to help the person who is lower and needs to get to a higher point of status. But then that rational lens says there is a trade-off and it cannot be ignored. And if it is ignored, it's going to show up anyway. And it may get brushed to the side, but it's still going to exist. But in coming back to the birds being taught by a Harvard professor how to fly, I just want to finish that thought. Basically, every iterative class where, still keeping on the birds being taught to fly in this 16-week lecture, every time that the birds are able to fly, which is basically guaranteed because it's their intuition, it's their instinct, the Harvard professor feels more assured that what they're teaching is the thing that is allowing those birds to fly. So they may begin writing books about it and saying, because the birds can fly, my method is the reason why they are flying. And that professor may get famous with that method of teaching. So in coming back to actual people, look at something like entrepreneurship. To teach entrepreneurship, of course, there are some principles you can teach, but the successful entrepreneur cannot, give their professor all the credit, especially if that professor was only lecturing to them and not actually working hands-on with them. And in talking about higher education just a little bit longer, one other thing that I wanted to mention, I briefly touched on it a second ago, but consensus-driven thought versus critical thought. And the way I'm defining the two, consensus-driven thought is the majority of the people side with this thing, so I'm also going to agree with it. Whereas critical thought says, I don't know how many people agree with this or disagree with that. I'm going to look at the problem, look at the data, everything involved in it, and I will come to a conclusion whether I agree or disagree with a premise, and have a rational argument for why. That is critical thought. And I definitely notice when it comes to moral issues, ethical issues, and in higher education, I would say I noticed it a little bit. I don't think I noticed it too much, but I think just on a general, societal standpoint, we are much more likely to take for granted a given moral issue. And we may say, X is the moral issue of our time. We need to do everything in our power to get rid of this thing, or add to it, or change it, or alter it, or rebel against it. But it completely denies the fact of why did we come to that conclusion? What was the rational argument for it? And the rational argument cannot be the majority of the people think that way. The only time that's acceptable is if you are a politician, and if you don't side with the majority, you're going to get voted out of office. So that's completely different. And so in that, stuff as it relates to activism, consensus-driven thought could work. I just don't want to see that infused in science, which should be all about critical thought and looking at the whole of research and not coming to a conclusion based on if it agrees or not with the consensus. That's my main point there. Science, keep it critical, keep it the individual coming to their own conclusion. But in concluding this episode, I wanted to bring in two more concepts. I will make this brief and very, very practical. Two concepts that they're opposing concepts. If you're able to use one versus the other, I think your life will just get easier, especially when it comes to decision making. What I'm talking about is the optionality approach to life versus the narrative approach to life. And I'll speak on these both just very briefly. The optionality approach to life basically says, I believe the future is inherently unpredictable. And because of that, I'm going to put my eggs in as many baskets as I can. Yes, there are certain elements that appear predictable. I may put more eggs in this one topic or this one pursuit because I think it's more likely to happen. But I'm not going to neglect the fact that something could come from out of the blue and completely destroy all of my plan A. So I'm going to have plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D, etc. But the narrative approach to life basically says the future is predictable. Because I can see the patterns of history and I can see the trend lines, I can assume that if the trend is going this way, it's going to continue that way. And so that allows the person to rationalize putting all their eggs in one basket. So this can relate to career, for one example, but it can also relate to, morals. Thinking this is the right way to act, to be moral. This is the right side of history to stand on. And of course, both sides are always saying that we're the heroes, we're the good, we're fighting evil. So let's just ignore that for a second. But the narrative approach says, because I know the future is predictable because the past has patterns that can be followed. I tend to side with the view of life, which is a optionality approach. And with the optionality approach to life, I'll just give a specific example with my job right now. I know I've mentioned it many times, but I'm a server at a restaurant. I have a job based in optionality. Because I'm an hourly worker, yes, there are some shortcomings compared to a salary worker. The person with a salary would get, insurance, a 401k, maybe the company invests some money into the 401k, paid time off. They get some benefits there. But with my approach, with being an hourly worker, I have what I consider the more important asset, which is time. My time I can use optionally. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but basically, if a better opportunity were to come up, it is much, much easier for me to either take time off or quit the job altogether to go for that better opportunity. Whereas someone in a salaried position, they're going to have their hands tied unless they're completely willing to drop their job and with that, some career-based reputation. And the thing I love about optionality, and this really does come from the Anti-Fragile book, the fact is, optionality is a really easy way to live life. So what do I mean by that? All you ever have to do is weigh 2 options, maybe 3 options against each other. Because I still do videography. I have a chance where I may have to miss a day of work, but I may make some money doing a videography shoot. Well, which makes more money? That's my metric. I'm not saying that's always the right metric, but okay, the videography shoot's gonna make me more money. So I will take off work that day and work that shoot. Even something like short films, which I'm not making money from. What matters more to me? It gets a little bit trickier to measure, but most likely I'm gonna side with working on the short film and taking off work in place of the other way around. Again, the salaried worker can't even contemplate that unless they're going to waste their paid time off on literally a different job. But I really like optionality because it allows for robust rationality. And what that means is all you have to do is be rational in the moment. Am I trying to make more money? Then I'll choose the opportunity that allows me to make more money. Am I trying to, increase my level of influence? Then I'm going to choose the thing that allows me to do that, or that I think will allow me to do that. So I hope that makes sense. Just maybe for creatives, I'll give one more example. So let's say, you're an artist and you want to grow your following. And you ask yourself, okay, should I spend time making reels? Should I make more art and just post the photo? Should I do something creative with the reels where I'm bringing in trending sounds and it takes more time to make the video, but it's more likely to trend and do well? In the optionality approach, you can see what works. You can test it. You don't have to stick to one thing. You're not bound to say, okay, I'm going to make, 20 different paintings in 20 days because I think it'll really boost my following. You can continue to test through trial and error. And whatever gets more views, because that's the thing or whatever gets you more followers, if that's what you're measuring, you just keep doing that. So it's a really, really simple approach to going about making decisions. But I do want to do the narrative side some justice. Because, I mentioned there are some benefits when it comes to, having a salaried career, insurance, you have more stability. But what about when it comes to something like a moral issue? Say climate change. The person who takes on the narrative approach will say, I've been looking at the prediction algorithms and it shows that, the climate, the global warming has been here. If we look at 2050, it's going to be up here and that will cause this to happen and that to happen, etc. I think that's a fair way to approach life, as long as you're using those other heuristics I mentioned, basically about, is this data falsifiable? Are they jumping to cause and effect instead of looking at correlation? As long as you're using some of those strategies, I understand the narrative approach to life, because it allows you to say, okay, let's take the assumption that climate change is going to basically wipe out the planet by 2050. Let's just take that for a second. Because of that, I'm going to drop everything that I'm doing and focus solely on that. Put all my videography skills, all my writing skills, all my, connections, talk to everyone I can about climate change and let's fight this and let's do everything we can. That is totally okay. I have no issue stopping a person who deeply desires to do that, so long as they don't start vilifying the person who is unwilling to do that, who is unwilling to drop everything for the sake of saving the planet. So I hope you see what I'm saying. I'm not saying that someone who denies the existence of human-caused climate change is okay. I'm not necessarily justifying that. But I'm saying someone can, accept the premise that climate change is, wiping out biodiversity. It's causing sea levels to rise, the temperature to increase, and it's being caused by humans. You could take that premise and still have a level of optionality. You can still basically exist in some way without devoting your life to fighting against climate change, without devoting your life to being a climate change activist. And, that's the thing where those people who may devote their life, who do take on the narrative approach to life, those are the people who are likely vilifying the people who take on an optionality approach. So now I'm speaking to you, the person who does take on that view. There's nothing wrong with that point of view. I have no issue if you put all your eggs in one basket. But do not belittle me or start name-calling me because I don't. Because I'm willing to take on an optionality approach. So that's all I'm asking in this episode. I know it's been a little bit all over the place. I really hope that the at least basic heuristics that I was able to lay out will help you when being confronted with news in the media, when being confronted with news in the classroom or information. Yeah, because this stuff is going to evolve. Especially as, again, I said in the last episode, as AI evolves, we're going to be awash in new information. And, this is just one extra episode, a couple more rules of thumb to just keep that level of healthy skepticism. That's really all I'm asking. Remain open and remain skeptical. And live your life from there. If you like this episode, it would mean a hell of a lot if you rated it on Spotify, on iTunes, left a nice review. Thank you.